didn't just now go, pick a disciple, pick a disciple, pick a disciple, before he did anything else. You know what I mean? He was doing things while he was gathering disciples. So we're not actually going to go completely chronologically now, but we're going to talk about the disciples that he chose tonight. He actually did start gathering them here and there while he was doing ministry. And what I want us to understand is that Jesus gathered he had many disciples. A disciple is a follower of Christ. So he had gathered together and had brought many to him that were his disciples and that were following him before he actually set 12 of them aside. So when we talk about disciples, we're going to talk about those 12, which Jesus actually called, and he called them, they're called apostles with a capital A. And the word apostle means sent ones. And I have come to understand and believe that there are no capital A apostles anymore. Okay? That those were 12 at a time in history that were given a specific duty and specific powers. And, you know, the big A apostles are no longer here. So we need to understand that Jesus was very careful in choosing these 12. Because what was their job? He was going to give them a pretty big job, right? Which, if you remember, and this kind of always confused me, he said to his disciples, to his apostles, he says, when I leave, you're going to do things even greater than me. You remember that? He said, you will do things greater than I. And I've come to understand what he was saying there is, when I leave, you're going to have a job of going to the whole world and telling them about me. You know, that's what I came to understand he was saying to them. So what I'm saying is that these 12, he's carefully selecting them because they are going to go and evangelize the world. They're going to go and tell the world about Christ. So I want us to look, I'm going to read from Luke chapter 6. I'm going to read verses 12 and 13 because I want you to see before Jesus really selected these 12, what he did. So Luke 6, 12 and 13, it says, in these days he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose from them 12, whom he named apostles. Woo, yay, I'm glad that I got it right. Everything I just said to you, we read right there, right? He had these disciples, he gathered them all, he selected 12 of them, and he called them apostles. But what did he do first? He spent the whole night in prayer. And I'm not here to give a sermon or a lesson tonight on prayer, but don't miss the lesson tonight on prayer. Before a major decision, before a major ministerial move there, Jesus spent the night seeking his Father in prayer. So I wanted you to get that. Now let's see who he chooses. And I'm going to tell you, I'm not your teacher, I'm not your professor. I might give you an exam at the end, because that's what I've always done in the Life of Christ class. But it's for you. It's for your own fun to see what you've learned and that sort of thing. But one thing I think I said last time is it's good for us to learn some of the basics, like to be familiar and know the Ten Commandments. That's just a good thing to know. It's also, I think, a good thing to know who the 12 disciples are. So maybe, if you're taking notes, maybe you want to jot down their names. I'm going to give you a little way to maybe remember who they are tonight. But I'm going to read from Mark 3, 13 to 19. There's a couple different places where we see who he chose, but I like this passage, Mark 3, 13 to 19. He went up on the mountain and called to him those whom he desired, and they came to him. And he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach, and have authority to cast out demons. He appointed the 12. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter. James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder, Andrew, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Okay? I'm going to read you something, and then I'll come back and give you maybe a little way that might be helpful to remember who the disciples are, who the apostles are. But before I read this, you need to understand that these were all ordinary men. Okay, you realize that, right? Fishermen. They were ordinary men. They were people that had chosen to follow Jesus. They were his disciples. They were ordinary guys. And after a night full of prayer, that's who he chose. Now, I have this little book. It's called Never the Same. And it just kind of tells stories. I mean, this obviously isn't scripture, but it kind of gives you an idea of what it was maybe like. You know, I want to recommend, and I hope none of you think I'm heretical in this or anything, but there's a show called The Chosen. I liked it. And so did Molly. They had season 1. You can find it online on YouTube. And they're about 50 minutes long. There's 8 episodes. And it's about Jesus. It's about the life of Jesus. And the thing that I was hesitant about, that many of us would be, is I hate when you, add words. You'll watch the thing, you'll be like, Jesus didn't say that, and I'm going to tell you, there's poetic license, and that always does kind of bother me. But I watched it enough and got into it enough that I really learned a lot. It really gave me a mindset of the times and what things maybe were like. So I'm not saying it's the greatest thing, but I enjoyed it and I found it beneficial. But this book that I'm going to read is kind of like that in a sense. And one thing I did learn from Chosen is kind of how he went about choosing his disciples. You just kind of see him going about. You kind of see, I don't know. All right, let me read this to you. It was a bright morning, cool, a little breezy. Wind scurried across the lake and snatched at my hair. My sons and I had spent the night fishing out on the boat. And just like so many other times, we'd come home, taken our fish to the market, and returned to the boat to mend the nets for the next night. Since they were teenagers, they liked the staying up late part, but they always grumbled about mending the net part. Who could blame them? I don't remember exactly what we were talking about, the weather, maybe, or the fishing. I remember telling them I didn't have many years left to be taking them out like this. Soon the boat and the business would all be theirs. It's a good life, predictable, steady, good income, sensible. I told them stuff like that before. And that's when we saw him. He was walking along the shore, a few other fishermen with him. We'd heard of this man, a real troublemaker. His name was Jesus. I recognized the 2 men with him, Peter and his brother Andrew. We'd fished together lots of times. They own a boat just up the shore from us, and they're good friends of my boys, James and John. I glanced toward their boat, empty. What were they doing with this man? Where were they going when there was so much work to be done? I set down the net for a moment and stared at them. He'd been a carpenter, I guess, that's what people said, but then one day he just took to the streets to travel and preach. They say he tells lots of stories, wastes lots of time. He was gesturing wildly with his hands. I couldn't quite make out what he's saying, but it must have been funny because the men with him were laughing. And then he called to us, "Come here." His voice cut through the sound of the morning breeze. "Come on, follow me." Was this guy serious? He waved his hand for us to join him. Follow him? Where? Toward what? "I'll show you how to fish for people," he says. Fish for people? And the men with him just nodded and smiled. Peter made fish slips at us, and Andrew broke into laughter. What had gotten into them? What kind of lunatic is this? How do you fish for people? He hadn't stopped walking. "Come on," he called again. In a moment, he would pass us by. I just shook my head and went back to work. You can't just drop everything and follow someone like that. It's not how the world works. But then, to my amazement, I heard James whisper, "What do you say, guys? Dad? John? Let's go. Let's do it." Before I could say anything, I heard the sound of sandals landing on the wet sand as James and then John jumped from the boat. Together they headed up the shoreline toward this man. "Hey, where are you going?" I yelled. "There's work to be done. What do you think you're doing? We need to finish fixing these nets." The wind blew hard against my back, whistling in my ears. For a moment they hesitated, and I thought they might just give up this nonsense. Then James turned and motioned for me to join him. "Come on, Dad," he yelled. "Come on." And that's when Jesus looked at me. The sunlight glinted in his eyes. He gestured toward me as if he were inviting me to come too. Yeah, right, as if I was going to follow him. I just stood there yelling to my sons, "What are you doing? We have nets to mend. We have work to do. We have to make a living here." Anger churned inside me. I could feel my chest rise and fall like the waves, like the ocean. My sons weren't coming back. They were walking away from me, from everything I'd worked for. I almost ran from the boat to grab them, to drag them back, to end this foolishness right then and there. "You don't even know this man," I shouted. But then another thought caught hold of me. "Nah, let them go, Zebedee. If they want to walk away from all this, let them. If they want to walk away from their own father, let them. They'll probably come crawling back in a few weeks anyway. After they find out their fishing for people doesn't pay all that well, and that you can't fry up and eat what you catch." "Fine, then," I screamed after them. "Go on, leave me. But I'm staying right here. Do you hear me? I'm staying right here." There comes a time in your life when you got to decide what you're going to live for, who you're going to follow. They could follow this Jesus if they wanted to. Let them. I made my choice that day. I stayed right where I was, like any sensible person would have done. For a few moments, I stood there in silence with the wind tugging at my hair, watching as my two sons walked away. For a while, their footprints glistened in the morning sun, then the waves washed over them, and they blurred together, disappearing into the sand. Then I cursed him under my breath and went back to work, fixing my nets. Now there's a passage of Scripture, Matthew 4:21 and 22. Going on from there, Jesus saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Don't miss those three telling words in that last sentence. And their father. They're easy to skip over, but they say so much. Sure, James and John left the boat to follow Jesus. They left their careers, their possessions, their priorities, their dreams, all that was involved in leaving the boat, but they also left their dad. Why? Because he wouldn't come. He heard the call of Jesus just as they did. He heard the words, and he didn't follow. He stayed in the boat that day. The time had come for them to make a choice. Who would they follow with their lives? The boys chose Jesus, their father did not. The Bible records more than a dozen instances when Jesus invited people to follow him. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. All too often they stayed right where they were because it's so secure there in the boat. So safe, so comfortable, so familiar. It's so easy to stay behind and watch Jesus walk away out of your life. Even though James and John are referred to throughout the Bible as the sons of Zebedee, their dad never appears in Scripture again. We only see him this one time, sitting in the boat, watching his sons walk away. That's his legacy. And I just want to read this part. When we follow Jesus, he doesn't promise a comfortable journey. Instead, he hands us a cross. And he says, from Luke 14, starting in verse 25 and verse 26. "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and cannot come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, 'This man began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king, going out to encounter another king in war, will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So therefore, any of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use, either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. The question to think about is, following Jesus always means leaving something behind. What is Jesus asking you to leave behind? What things don't belong in your life? What do you need to walk away from in order to follow him? So, I wanted to bring that in as we talk about the disciples, to give us a clearer picture of what it means to be a disciple. I didn't want to just say, hey, Jesus just went and picked these 12 guys and they just gave up, there they were. You get a sense of they were men, they were humans. They had lives, they had family. And, we get a little picture there of maybe what it would have been like to have been called to leave it all. And we hear what Jesus says, to leave it, to leave and follow him. And he says that to all of his disciples, including you and me. So as we continue talking about the disciples, the 12, I want to give you how I remember them. And I ran this by Mike, and he seemed to think it was all right. But first, I'll tell you, Bartholomew, he's also called Nathaniel. Okay? Because this is part of memorizing the 12. Bartholomew is called Nathaniel. And Thaddeus, I don't know if you know what he's often commonly called, Judas. Not Judas Iscariot, but a different Judas. So when we look and we see the listing of the apostles, when we see Bartholomew, we can know that that is Nathaniel. We see Thaddeus, we can know that that is Judas. Okay? So the way that I have remembered these, it was real simple for me. I got it down. I've had it down for years. But it kind of started off with, it's almost like Japan, but it's not. John, Andrew, Peter, Philip, Nathaniel. So it's more like Japan. But in my mind, I could think John, Andrew, Peter, Philip, Nathaniel. Oh. And then it's James, Judas, because there's two Jameses and there's two Judases. And then I just never really had a problem remembering Matthew, Thomas, Simon. I don't know how you can Matthew, Thomas. So I can rattle off John, Andrew, Peter, Philip, Nathaniel, James, Judas, Matthew, Thomas, Simon. If it works for you, it works. But I think there's value because I find that just sometimes when I'm just reading scripture and I come across a name like, oh yeah, that was one of the 12. You may not even realize who all the 12 were if you haven't committed them to memory. I'm studying Acts chapter 8, where Philip goes to the Ethiopian eunuch. Philip was one of these 12. If I didn't know that, I wouldn't know that. But it may be helpful to, hopefully it'll help you. Japan, John, Andrew, Peter, Philip, Nathaniel, James, Judas, Matthew, Thomas, Simon. Good luck, guys. So, let's talk about what was Jesus doing here. He chose 12. There was something special about them. He chose 12 men because with these 12, he dedicated his life to them. He spent his life with them. They traveled with him everywhere. They heard all his teachings. They saw his miracles. They saw his life. He spent the majority of his time teaching them and loving them and pouring of himself into them. Why? Because he was preparing them for ministry, right? He was preparing them for what they were going to do, which was a great task for after he left. Understand? And so, inadvertently over the years, and now it's intentional, just in watching Jesus and studying his life and teaching this, somehow along the lines, I kind of said, I want to follow Jesus' pattern in ministry. And what I see Jesus did is Jesus would go out and he would preach to the crowds. And then he would spend his life pouring into the 12. And then he also spent a great deal of time with 3 of those 12, right? James, Peter, and John. And so that's kind of been the model of ministry that I have tried to follow over the last several years. I love the opportunities that I've been given, and hopefully will again here in the near future, to go out and preach to the crowds. Sunday mornings, I was preaching at churches regularly. And that was kind of the chance to go and do that. And then to pour into your lives. And I never really did the count, but there may be 12, And then I've been real intentional about pouring into a few of the younger men, kind of like the James, Peter, and John, all in preparation for ministry, to go out and do what Jesus called his disciples to go out and do. So that's the job of a pastor, to prepare the saints, to equip them to do the work of ministry. So that's just kind of tried to follow that. Seems like it's a good plan, right? So there's not enough time to do the next section. So I always enjoy when we talk. Let me give a quick review and tell you what the next section is. I thought we'd get through 2 more sections. After Jesus has assembled his disciples, the next thing he's going to go and do is perform the first miracle, right? So we're going to talk about his first miracle, and then after that, he's going to travel to Jerusalem for the Passover and cleanse the temple. He actually, I don't know if you realize this, but he actually did that twice. There was actually 2 times where he went in and cleansed the temple. Cleanse in the sense of flip tables. So we'll get into that, and then maybe his chat with Nicodemus. But I guess tonight, what we covered was the disciples. So let's just let you guys talk. Hopefully something was. I hope you got something out of it.